You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 8th of July, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Oof! France breathes out after the far right is pushed into third place in the parliamentary elections. But what now for a nation with a totally gridlocked National Assembly? Major reforms, difficult decisions. The UK Labour government gets to work, but who's in the cabinet to do so? And why are tourists in Barcelona being attacked by people brandishing water pistols? I'm Emma Nelson, and the Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Emma Nelson, and my guests, Samira Shackle and Jonathan Fenby, will discuss the day's big stories, as well as a check-in with Andrew Muller, who's at the Nato General Assembly in Washington. Stay tuned. All that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. So let's dive in and say hello and a very happy Monday to Samira Shackle, freelance journalist and author of Karachi Vice, Life and Death in a Contested City, and Jonathan Fenby, former editor of the South China Morning Post and a writer on France and Europe. A very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
We've all three of us have accepted that we're staggering around a little bit with the aftermath of quite a lot of elections in this neck of the woods. And I think that sort of sets the tone for the next 30 minutes. How's your weekend been, Samira?
My weekend's been fine. I've been ingesting more sort of political podcasts and radio shows than I typically would in a weekend. It's all been very exciting.
Excellent. And Jonathan, you and I have discussed the joys of following French election results in real time last night on the telly.
Indeed. It's become an absolute bad habit of mine ever since I was a correspondent in Paris that I have to stay up and watch all the elections and the results and the studio debates, which are usually just a matter of people shouting at one another.
This is what I found quite astonishing, because having witnessed enough debates in the last few days, especially when it comes to the UK elections, where people are a bit spiky and rude, etc., etc. This is a full-on shouting match that you get, and as a result, none of those smartly dressed women, mainly, and indeed men, actually get their point across.
No, indeed. They all come in with their position, and they just shout it as long as they're given time to do so.
I wonder how much shouting there'll be today. I suspect not very much. Let's take a rather decorous...
There seems to be, according to television reports anyway, from Paris, the television news, there seems to be a kind of morning after feeling.
Well, we shall keep it upbeat, chirpy, and no argumentative moments. Well, I don't know. Feel free to have a bit of a Barney, but let's dive straight into this parliamentary special. In a moment, we'll be looking at the way the UK government is shaping up in terms of who's been put in charge of what. But first, France's voters ultimately turned away from giving the far right its first real taste of power last night. It had been widely predicted that the National Rally, the party of Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella, was poised to seize an outright majority in France's parliament, the Assemblée Nationale. But clever and tactical manoeuvres by both the electorate and the country's other parties pushed the RN into third place and the Assemblée into political gridlock. It was the result of some incredibly clever manoeuvring, wasn't it, Jonathan, by both those parties who did everything they could to stop the National Rally, but also the electorate who played along.
Absolutely. And I think that's what most commentators underestimated in advance, the extent to which the electors would actually follow the manoeuvring by the centrist and left-wing parties.
And just looking at the way that things are done, Samira, on a more general view of how elections are run, what I always find incredibly admirable about France is its ability to hold a second round. So instead of chucking everybody off a cliff at first go, they have that week where everybody can just sort of sit down, get themselves sorted, and also just do what I think is described as holding your nose, that you vote for the least worst. And we saw people yesterday who were voting for the left when ordinarily there were right-wing voters and vice versa, with the simple goal of getting the National Rally out of the spotlight. But it does it's a good example of how democracy is sort of well organised.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting phenomenon, that, and France does have form on coming very, very close to the brink with electing far-right politicians, both in presidential races and obviously, as we've seen this week, for the Assembly. I think there is something impressive about that, about people staying engaged enough to come out a second time. We've just seen our own election with a very kind of very, very low turnout compared with other elections. And so I think that having that opportunity, that sort of safeguard built in does seem to have worked. And I think it's quite different when you're facing an actual election result from the first round to when you're seeing polls, which, as we know, can be flawed and were flawed, in fact, for this second round of voting.
Yeah, I mean, it was very impressive the way the Front Républicain against the rally, the RN, lined up across the country, both the voters and the parties involved. But it leaves an awful problem thereafter. It's really it's a short term. It's, if I may say so, typical of the French way of operating. It's a short term solution, but that leaves a long term problem. Because the National Rally, let's not forget, they may have been knocked into third place in terms of seats, but they still won 37% of the vote. And that's a big number, much more than the left or the centrists. And it leaves, I would say, Le Pen still on track for the Élysée in 2027.
The interesting thing that we find out at the moment is how that moment when everybody did what they needed to do to achieve one thing may not have created a hemicycle, a parliament that actually represents French people. And
I guess just as Jonathan's saying, the fact that it's essentially deadlocked now, it's quite hard to see how anyone moves forward, and all the sort of grievances that the RN voters have. I think there's a lot of the same drivers as in other European countries, same as in America. There's disaffection, there's the cost of living crisis, there's all of these things which become harder to address. They're already hard to address, and they become even harder to address when you have a political deadlock and a parliamentary body that's essentially split three ways, and people who don't really want to work with each other.
And the left-wing alliance where most of the leaders can't stand each other.
Yes, it only came into existence as an alliance.
An alliance against something, but not for anything.
Because we saw immediately after the results, the first one out of the firing gun was Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's the far left firebrand. And when you look at him, you just think, actually, are you for real? Because he's just an angry throwback to the 1970s. And you sit there and you think, do these people still exist in modern politics? But actually, yes, he does. And
yes, he
could cause enormous problems for everybody.
And he's going to push his own agenda and his own personal interests, I think, to the ultimate there. So it's really a question long term. It's Macron against Mélenchon against Le Pen. So you've still got that triangular fight going on.
And how stable does that leave France? Because we can never underestimate just how powerful a country it is.
Of course. And I think, as Jonathan said, we're looking ahead to the presidential election in 2027. I think it's very easy, given the results of the first round of these elections, it's quite easy to think, it's a great victory and the RN's been beaten back. But let's not forget they've essentially doubled their seats. That's still in. Yeah. If that had been the first result, we'd be talking about that. So, it's not a terrible result for them. Other than by comparison
they just
to the first round.
Put the bar too high, I think, and they've been caught out.
And what we also saw was the presence of very charismatic young characters in France's political world at the moment. I mean, having just emerged from 14 years of the same government, when one could regularly hear the sound of a barrel being scraped for someone who could step up and do a job, to the point where they had to bring in David Cameron to be Foreign Secretary here in the UK because he was the person who knew the most. When you look at the speakers in France now, you have the likes of Jordan Bardella, 28 years old, a phenomenally convincing communicator. Then you have Raphael Gluckman for the Socialists. And then you have Prime Minister Attal for Renaissance, who's been told to stay in his job for the time being to act as a caretaker. This is going to shape up to be a really interesting decade, isn't it, Jonathan? Because, you've written 4 books, and one of the last one was a history of modern France, taking you up to Macron. Do you need to start writing a new chapter on
absolutely
on this new dawn of very, very clever communicators?
If the publisher wants it, absolutely. But I mean, Macron, in a sense, he has revolutionised everything by destroying the old political setup of the Fifth Republic, destroying, in effect, the Socialist Party until at least these elections, and Glucksmann coming back with quite a strong socialist position. But it's above all in the centre-right. The question is whether Macron can construct something new which can beat Le Pen in 2027.
And in the middle of all that, France has to operate internationally. And when you have a paralysed parliament, which is what we're looking at the moment, or divided quite neatly mainly into 3 large chunks, Left Alliance, Central, and then the far right. What does this mean for France's ability to deal with issues of Ukraine when you have the likes of France's military might being sort of second to none in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, it's not good for anyone when a parliament is deadlocked in that way, and I think particularly a country that has been a leader within Europe. I mean, you're seeing increasingly governments around Europe facing these kind of deadlocks and stases, and I think it obviously kind of feeds into the behaviour of the bloc. It's not an ideal situation for anyone.
And you've got in France, there is the whole external issue, indeed, with Macron probably going on trying to run foreign and defence policy. But you've got the economy, which is it's not in bad shape, but it's facing a lot of major problems, particularly with the size of the deficit, the government deficit. And that will make the budget this autumn a very, very difficult process for whichever government takes over. And if it's Mélenchon and the hard left, as it were, then you've got the whole international bond market, which will turn off on France.
Which, at the moment, the markets were rather relieved, I believe, from last night, given the fact that they thought the National Front was going to come in. But, that collective sigh of relief that was breathed internationally was obviously then replaced by a sharp intake of breath, thinking, actually, we've got another problem.
Actually, can Macron now put together a centre moderate left alliance for the government? And that's the question of the next week. Indeed.
I mean, given your knowledge of modern France, how much precedent is there? Because they do, cohabitation is often the watchword between the president and the parliament working at odds, but somehow managing to fumble through.
It has been in the past under Mitterrand and under Chirac, who were wily operators, both of them as president. But now you've got the prospect at the extreme of Macron having to cohabit with a Mélenchon-led government, which would overturn all his major reforms, starting with the pensions.
And it is a sharp contrast of the size of the majority that the Labour Party enjoyed here at the end of last week. And the new elected Labour government is now beginning to show its hand in terms of where it wants to lead the UK and who it wants to do it. I mean, they've had plenty of time to prepare, 14 years, in fact. And the players in Sir Keir Starmer's new government arguably demonstrate that they've been thinking about this quite hard, haven't they? Because, Samira, we've got a combination of sort of like the expected newcomers, such as the Deputy Prime Minister and the Chancellor. But we got some old names as well. We've got the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, who's, she played in the last Blair government, plus Alan Milburn in health, Jackie Smith in education. If you're listening to this in the United Kingdom, I never thought I'd be saying Alan Milburn on the radio anytime soon, but here he is back in the game. But we also have these interesting external characters, don't we? We have the new Attorney General, who is a high-flying barrister, and we have a prisons minister who's a businessman who runs a key cutting company.
And who's also the chair of the Prison Reform Trust Board. So, I think that's his expertise. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting mix. The really notable thing, I think, given the level of ministerial churn that we've had, particularly in the last 5 years with the Conservative government, you talked about scraping the barrel earlier. And I think as we've increasingly seen sort of internal Conservative Party fights over Brexit and other issues playing out in national government, there's been such a rapid turnover. I mean, whenever I'm reporting on any aspect of UK sort of social policy, the thing that comes up more and more from anyone working in these areas has been that, it's really hard to get a handle on anything because the ministers are changing so quickly and the direction's always veering around and nothing's really happening. And I think that first and foremost, what Starmer, he's emphasised repeatedly stability and competence and so on. And I think in keeping basically not all, but almost all the people who are in their shadow cabinet appointments, transferring them over to the new cabinet, I think there's a clear emphasis on that stability. And I think that's probably what he's trying to do with these kind of figures from the Blair and Brown governments. It's people with expertise, people who know the brief and so on. But as you said, bringing in people from outside, that's also kind of echoes what Gordon Brown did with his famous government of all the talents, trying to bring in expertise from outside with mixed results, I think. But it's interesting. Be interesting to see how it plays out. And some of it's going to wind up parts of the Labour Party for sure.
And there is that theory, isn't there, that what you do is age brings energy. Age brings wisdom and youth brings energy. Although I'm not quite sure whether that's sort of still 100% applicable. But Jonathan, how useful or helpful is it to bring back old names into a government which should be bringing a fresh start?
Well, I think that reflects your question, a broader issue, which is that Starmer wants two things. He wants stability, but he wants change. And whether those two are compatible is going to be the big question for the next year or so in Britain. And bringing some old experience back must, in Starmer's mind, be of use indeed. But he's got to show the ability to change. And he's got to somehow, which is very difficult given the nature of the problems he faces and the state of Britain, he's got to show some results fairly quickly, I would say.
He's also gone really hard and fast internationally, hasn't he, since the beginning? Today we are hearing things about housing policy and how much money is left in the kitty that the Conservatives have left. But we've already had Chancellor Rachel Reeves saying that she wants to revisit parts of the Brexit deal. We've had, Sir Keir Starmer is on his way to Nato. He's already said he's scrapping the controversial Rwanda deportation plan, which has been picked up a lot by the international press. And we've also had David Lammy really whacking up those air miles by doing, I think he did Sweden, Germany, Poland. I can't remember who the other one is. That immediately suggested that this was a government which thinks internationally as quickly as it thinks domestically.
Yeah, and they've had a lot of time to prepare for it also. But I think that they've put growth at the centre of their plans, haven't they? And I think given that they've also really, we'll see what happens with their self-imposed fiscal rules, but given that how the extent to which they've hemmed themselves in borrowing to invest, seeking that kind of growth, there has to be an engagement with the outside world. And so I think they probably want to market Britain as somewhere that's now stable for a long time after. It's something that we haven't been able to say for a long time, but I get the sense that that's sort of the pitch they're making. And without kind of saying the words, because it's a sort of anathema to be critical of Brexit. If you're in a position of political power, they probably don't want to alienate the right-wing press to that extent, which they're already getting a lot of blowback. But I think a recognition that Brexit has been extremely economically damaging, and there are perhaps areas in which they could seek to redress some of that without kind of going back on it.
To be cynical, the international is easy in a sense. You jet off to a few places, you make a few speeches, you allow Ramonas like myself to think there may be some hope. Indeed.
While trying not to anger the Mail and the Telegraph too much.
Exactly, while keeping on saying. But the real problems are basically at home. They are with growth and they are with the quality of government services.
Which for the first time actually is intimately connected with our international relations, because it is still thought that we'll lose 4% of GDP because of Brexit.
Yes. Yeah. But you're not going to go back on Brexit. Starmer's not. He's going to be part of his caution, part of the stability mantra is basically to leave Brexit in one corner.
Make Brexit work, apparently, is the phrase.
Yes.
Jonathan Fenby, Samira Shackle, stay with us in a moment. I'm Emma Nelson. You're listening to the Monocle Daily. We head to Washington, D.C. now, where we can join our contributing editor, Andrew Muller, who's there for the NATO summit. A very good afternoon to you, Andrew.
Good afternoon, Emma.
So let's talk about NATO, 75th anniversary. What are the main topics which will be dominating the agenda? I think we can safely say that Ukraine will be front and centre once again.
We can absolutely safely say that, not least in the light of the most recent barrage of missiles that Russia appears to have launched against Ukraine in the last 24 hours or so. It's possibly not even a reach to suggest that the timing is not coincidental. Recall, of course, that Russia contrived for Alexei Navalny to die in custody just as the Munich Security Conference was getting underway earlier this year. But yes, Ukraine will, for, well, the third year running, be the dominant topic at this NATO summit. There's some talk, as there has been the last couple of years, about will NATO say anything definitive about Ukraine's path to membership. Listeners may recall that President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine was quite unusually and publicly miffed with his Western allies when such an offer was not forthcoming after Vilnius last year. But yeah, it's going to be pretty much Ukraine. There will be a side order, I'm sure, of China and the Middle East, but Ukraine is going to be the big thing.
And one of the things that always is probably the biggest areas of tussle when it comes to individual countries and their role within NATO is the amount of money that each country is prepared to stump up to contribute to security. And that's made increasingly difficult at the moment, or increasingly interesting, should one say, is that many of the countries who are coming, or whose leaders are coming, are nations in flux because of rather discombobulating elections.
Well, I think that's probably always the case with any alliance past a certain number of members. But yes, that's absolutely correct. The domestic politics of various members will be preoccupying everybody here, not least, of course, the domestic politics of the host nation. Now, this summit will be presided over by President Joe Biden, and the discussions around his fitness to serve, the propriety and or good sense of him seeking re-election are obviously a massive, massive theme, not just of America's discourse at the moment, but the world's. President Emmanuel Macron of France will be appearing amidst a backdrop of, domestic political chaos, quite remarkable even by French standards, though the fact, I think, that the tactical voting among left-leaning French voters bumping the National Rally into third place will have a harming effect on quite a lot of people, because the last thing I think anybody attending this summit really wants is for both the United States and France to have some sort of isolationist conniption at the same time. And of course, there will be an amount of curiosity attending Sir Keir Starmer, the very new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. But I don't think there are any concerns attending him. I think people will be pleased to see the leader of what looks like a solid and stable, to borrow a phrase, British government. And Starmer has all throughout his time as leader of the opposition been nothing but rock solid where Ukraine is concerned. And the one point of continuity probably between the incoming Labour government and the outgoing Conservative government is that support for Ukraine is seen as, not even a debate.
Indeed, I think we've seen already Sir Keir Starmer in a video, including a segment where he talks to Volodymyr Zelensky already, that the change to a Labour government makes no difference to the support that you will see from the UK in the way that Whitehall reacts to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. How much does that sort of gee up other countries to renew their commitment?
I think it can't help but do that. And it's not a surprise to anybody, in much the same way that the results of last Thursday's election were not a surprise to anybody. It was anticipated for months, if not years. So people will have been assuming that roundabout now they would be dealing with Keir Starmer and a Labour government of the United Kingdom. But yeah, I'm sure it will have a buoying effect. There will, of course, be NATO generally trying to spin an upbeat tale of renewal as well, because one of the other narratives of this summit is that it will be the last at which Jens Stoltenberg, the long-serving Secretary General, appears in that role. He is being supplanted, of course, by the former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte. And as an only in America thank you to Jens Stoltenberg, he has been given the honour of throwing out the first pitch later this afternoon when the Washington Nationals host the St. Louis Cardinals.
Andrew Muller, thank you so much. And we're not going to ask you who you're going to be talking to in the next few days, because that's all a big secret, who you're going to be fielding for the future episodes of The Foreign Desk. Andrew Muller in Washington. Thank you. Well, let's pick up on a couple of the issues that we were talking about a moment ago with Andrew. Samira, just listening to you, or just listening to that, the one thing that you could just hear Andrew talking about throughout, the common theme was continuity, stability. As the rest of the world tries to, votes itself silly, NATO is trying to keep a handle on things.
It's trying to, I guess. But I was just reading today about how European leaders are sort of trying to Trump-proof what might happen next, and sort of bringing various elements of Ukraine spending into NATO controls, since Trump has signalled that he might want to reduce investment, and that more generally there's sort of conversations in Europe around being less reliant on America, which obviously changes the whole sort of contracted nature of the NATO agreement. So I think while it may be emphasising continuity and seeking that stability, I think that no institutions are completely immune at the moment.
Is that something that the European Union at least had to learn hard when Trump was in power last time? It had to learn to Trump-proof itself. But since then, we've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So there's a fresh test.
There's the Trump issue. There's also the Biden issue, whether Biden actually can give the kind of leadership required, particularly on Ukraine and particularly in Washington itself with Congress. Not just with Trump, but with the Republicans in Congress. And I must say, with the Russian barrage against of missiles against Ukraine today, which we've seen, that is going to be a real test.
What's interesting as well, some breaking news from the New York Times, is that they've got an exclusive report saying that Parkinson's expert visited the White House 8 times in 8 months. The White House said that President Biden has no signs of the disease, and there's been no reason to update the most recent testing conducted in February. But when you have someone who's just about to lead the charge at NATO, and at the same time you have the definitive record of doctors coming in just to check on his health, doesn't help, does it?
Absolutely not. And I mean, I was hearing from Democratic Party sources in Washington, I think a year ago, of his decline, his cognitive decline, as it's called. And in a sense, now we're getting into the very dangerous period where people are starting to say, was his debate performance a one-off, as he will present it, caused by illness and fatigue, or is that the way actually he is most of the time? And his subsequent talk, where he was reading off the instructions off the teleprinter, won't help.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that really struck me in a lot of the reporting after the debate performance was that so many of Biden's allies and, sources briefing journalists in his favour were saying things like, he has bad days, but, some of the time, at least, he's really sharp and capable of following complex conversations and making difficult decisions. And you kind of think, well, some of the time it's not reassuring.
We hope so.
It's not at least some of the time he can follow complicated conversation. It's not at all reassuring.
No, because you want to know, you want the bar to be at a certain level, don't you?
Absolutely.
I mean, we all have days when we don't follow complicated conversations, but we hope that when it comes to it, hopefully, in this room, for example, we can try and make sense of complicated things. Yeah. Not least so if you're listening, you know what we're talking about. But anyway, some of us sometimes need a break from it all. And let's imagine, ladies and gentlemen, we're on a mini break in Barcelona, getting away from all the troubles of the world. You're just about to settle down with a nice cortado when all of a sudden you're deliberately squirted with water by a group of angry locals, because Barcelona's residents, unhappy at the amount of tourists coming to visit, have taken matters into their own hands and are spraying visitors with water. They're also taping off hotels and restaurants and hurling insults at them. What do we think of that?
Well, I think we're seeing lots of protests or discontent, should I say, with tourism or over-tourism more specifically in lots of places. And I think it's unfortunate that, obviously the individual tourists are not at fault there, but it's clearly an expression of a deeper frustration, which I think is with cost of living, with inflated rents, with the poor regulation of things like Airbnb, the effect that has on local housing markets and so on. And I think those grievances are fair enough, really. It's not necessarily the fault of the people who've come on holiday and are sitting and having a coffee, but I think that it's a sign of something, and I think that the emotion it expresses is fair.
The question I pose is whether badly behaved tourists are targeted in particular.
I don't think so.
Or if you're just sitting there innocently having your sangria, are you
the
likely
videos
to
I
be
saw were just
sprayed?
People sort of sitting and quietly
having a coffee. But it has
coffee.
spread over a lot of places, Venice, Mallorca, Canary Islands.
And I think there's a
so
difference. You see in some places, including elsewhere in Spain, local authorities introducing fines for badly behaved tourists, and I think that's something quite different. I think it was in I can't remember where in Spain, but somewhere there heavy fines for urinating in the sea, things like that. But that's slightly different. That is targeting the people who are behaving badly.
Spain seems to be particularly active in this.
I remember, though, a few years ago, in the immediate aftermath of COVID, and talking to Spain's tourism minister, and the look on her face was, we need people back because of the dependence of Spain on and the economy.
That's the point. I mean, that's the other point that you could say, to take devil's advocate position. OK, spray the tourists, but you want their money.
Indeed, and also you've asked people to come, but that for whatever you think of the limiting of group numbers in Venice and the daily rate that you have to pay to come into Venice or something like that. That is not going to stop what is clearly a tremendous problem for Venice. You can't move left, right, and centre. But actually, if you see completely innocent people having a really nasty time and being sprayed, that's going to stop you from that's going to really put you off.
Absolutely.
And you just think, what's the wider implication for Spanish soft power? A group of clearly angry and in many cases justifiably angry people because they can't get housing. Their town has been overrun. But actually, if you just think of the wider prospects, Spain's tourism will be defined perhaps by some badly behaved people.
So, is the next stage in this a tourist boycott of places like Barcelona?
What would you do to stop people sort of like being over tourism? I dare say the water pistol's pretty useful. It's a pretty handy and efficient way of doing things.
Well, it could be that if you're too hot, you would actually welcome
being
sprayed
with a water pistol.
Yes.
Run
Better than a shower.
Run towards the guns, ladies and gentlemen. How about you, Samira? What would you do?
Let's have mobile air conditioners.
Just no air conditioners. That's enough to put loads of people off. Finally, on today's programme, Yemen's war has ground on for a decade, killing hundreds of thousands and displacing millions, and involving the militaries of more than a dozen countries. Yet today, it rarely commands the headlines. But one of the few journalists who have consistently reported on Yemen's agonies up close is the Egyptian photojournalist Asma Waghi. Her new book, Unfinished War, A Journey Through Civil War in Yemen, turns her lens on Yemen's people. Monocle's Andrew Muller spoke to Asma earlier and began by asking why she thinks so little attention has been paid to Yemen's so-called forgotten war.
To be honest, I was wondering myself. It's hard to put maybe one aspect, I think, but I discovered for the first time when I was there how much international media can control how important something is, Because I remember for some time there was a New York Times person in Cairo, a correspondent, and he's foreigner. And when there was a war in Hodeida and there was like a lot of attention and really wanted to make a big story in Yemen about how Saudi Arabia is involved, it just like sometimes it just comes and goes depending on what's happening around the world, and I think the three aspects in general I'm thinking of is that the first thing, and I think the most important aspect is that how it's a proxy war and many countries are involved in a way, but sometimes they don't like to talk about the subject because they are involved, And another thing, looking at Yemen, I mean, the Yemeni people are very nice, but it's funny that I discovered there from the first time I went that sometimes some people are kidnapped, but not really for a terrorism reason or something. That even during Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was the late president who was, left during the Arab Spring, even when it was the normal republic and so on, and there wasn't any civil war going on, during his time, there was a lot of, because it's a tribal society, especially in the north and so on, sometimes some foreigners are kidnapped just because the area, they needed some to ask certain things from the government. And this is how they drew their attention. And with different people kidnapped and with the presence of Al-Qaeda, I think it also makes people worry a lot when they go there. And even the people there, the government, are worried when they have journalists, especially they are Western. They like sometimes to take the precautions so they don't get the same thing,
So when you go there with your camera, though, as a photography, obviously there's any numbers of things you could be photographing. In terms of choosing not just what to photograph, but what to put in the book, was there a particular idea of Yemen you were hoping to capture and hoping to broadcast?
Now, before actually thinking about the book, because it happened after I went already several times to different cities, I was going mainly as a freelance photojournalist, or trying to find stories and report on this underreported on story. And when I do this, like I do anything else, I just go without having a fixed idea what I'm going to do, because you never know what you're going to find. So it can be like, of course, if I'm in a place and there is a front line, I want to visit the front line. I want to visit the displacement camps. I want to see the city. I want to see the market. I want to see and take photos for anything I could in any place. And that's what always my idea. And sometimes even I didn't have a preceded idea, like, well, I'm a photographer. I'm not necessarily a very good reporter, like checking every day what's happening. And I remember the first time I go to Yemen, I went to Sana'a because I was interested in the place first, that if I managed, I got a pass from the Houthi side. And I asked some journalists who went there to get me connection with the Houthi people in charge. And when I went there, I tried from Sana'a to go to Taiz, because basically I was just in a bus. I was just in a hotel, in a small hotel, and I find the place packed with people running away from Taiz because of the fighting. And I realized how much Taiz was, maybe was suffering much more than just the capital, because it's run by the Houthis, but there is no direct shooting at any place in the city. But in Taiz, it's as many people can be killed just from because it's quite hilly. Mm-hmm. And there are people get caught in the fire because of the way they are situated. The many places or a normal street, but looks like also like not a front line, but it's under the fire. And when I saw all these people coming and running away, I realized how much Taiz is important. And I couldn't go from the Houthi side because they suspect that if I'm a journalist, that I would like to go to the pro-government side and maybe report on something else. So they refused for me to go simply from one city to the city. So I ended up coming to Egypt back and go to Taiz. And I thought that's more important story to tell. So sometimes, I could just get the idea, whether because I'm following the news, or I know, for instance, like I went to Ma'rib. It was at that time a very fierce fighting. And I thought I have to go. But sometimes you just realize it when you are there, the situation of other cities. So it's just really, you cannot control sometimes the story. It's not like I'm really like a reporter in one place and I have to go only when one specific story is happening.
Finally then, and this seems like a counterintuitive question given the crisis that has beset Yemen for 10 years and everything we've just been discussing, but from your photographs and what's written around the photographs, there's a real affection for Yemen that comes across, and a real affection for the Yemeni people. So I guess I'll close by asking, what is it you actually like about Yemen? What do you enjoy when you go back there?
It's a good question. It's just like, first of all, I remember when I was really was a kid, my father was when he was just graduated from military school, he was very young, maybe 20 or 21, and he had to go to Yemen because Egypt was involved in a coup, and they wanted to get this imamate out of these people based themselves in religious whatever, and the rest of the people want a republic. So Nasser, former Egyptian president, was interfering at that time and sent a lot of troops. And I heard a lot of stories. And for me, I was very impressed when I was young to hear my father's stories, because it's for me, it sounds like a little bit Afghanistan. It's a very wild place, and the way he was describing, and the way you can see a lot of stuff coming out from Yemen and photos, but it seems to be like the way he described it was a little bit tribal, a little bit looks like some places in the past, just like has a great nature because when he was there, he was more in the hills area in the north. It's just the way he was even describing the kids. He said, I remember saying some kids would come and they are not afraid to die. It's just like one youngster would come and see all this Egyptian battalion and he can just fire because for him, it's a foreign soldiers. It's just whatever I saw and read from Yemen. And I really wanted to go anyway. I remember once I wanted just to go for a visit, but it didn't work. And when I was working for Reuters news agency for a while, I even asked while I covering the Arab Spring at that time for Egypt, Syria, and Libya. I also checked if I can go to Yemen, but some other people were going and I was needed more in Egypt and Libya. So I ended up not going. So I just left my work. And 2 weeks after I was in Yemen. In 2016. So it's actually, even while I was Reuters, I was trying hard to convince my boss to check if there is anything when the Houthi controlled the capital and even before during the early days of the Arab Spring. So I was really like waiting for the time that I'm free and just go to the place I wanted to go for a long time.
And that was the Egyptian photojournalist Asma Wagi speaking to Monocle's Andrew Muller. And that's all the time we have for today's edition of the Monocle Daily. The warmest of thanks to today's panellists, Samira Shackle and Jonathan Femby, and to the producer Henry Rees Sheridan and researcher Gunnar Gronlid and Sana Jamani. Our sound editor was Flynn Simons. I'm Emma Nelson here in London. The Monocle Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.